いぞカメラ強いぞカメラ
Hello everyone, I am Zazubaar, and welcome to Day 6 of Gamera Palooza. And welcome to the 70s, man! Aw man, things are about to get totally groovy up in this Palooza, man. We're gonna talk about giant monsters and aliens and Gamera. Wait a minute, did I mention Gamera? Anyway, I'm not going to do the whole review in that voice, because that would be really annoying, but it might be really entertaining. I just want to hear Leo from that 70s show review all of the Gamera movies. You know what? That just gives me an idea. Anyway, indeed, kids, welcome to the 1970s era of the Gamera franchise, which is an interesting part of the franchise for me personally, because of the 2 and kind of 3 Gamera movies produced in the 1970s, I haven't seen any of them. As of the recording of this review, and am watching them for the first time for this review series. So this was the first time I actually sat down and watched tonight's movie, which is interesting because I think I always avoided the last couple movies in the Showa Gamera series because you always hear about how infamous they are for being really bad. And as we explored in the last 2 videos, we already saw that Showa Gamera started to kind of become that very super campy, super for kids, kind of cheap TV quality type of Gamera movie. So I think I avoided these next few Gamera movies because I wasn't interested in them. I wasn't interested in watching a bunch of movies that wasn't really going to give me anything entertainment-wise or anything kind of unique-wise. It was just going to kind of be a big monster fight movie that wasn't all that well made and wasn't giving me anything story-wise. I had no interest in that. And I expected for these last couple of Showa Gamera movies, and I dreaded, as you heard at the end of the last video, or not dreaded, but I wasn't especially looking forward to seeing some super campy Gamera movies. And getting into today's movie, 1970s Gamera vs. Jiger, I have to say, I expected something super campy, and what I got wasn't really all that super campy. I was actually really surprised. Gamera vs. Jiger is weird, because it's not really that weird. I was really shocked. What we actually got was a film that kind of returns almost to the earlier parts of the franchise, particularly Gamera vs. Gauss, in terms of its tone. It's a mix of both the campy elements and the more serious elements of the Gamera franchise. You've got the more campy elements of Gamera being the friend to all children, and you've still got the fucking theme song. But you've got a more serious monster story here involving a curse, ancient mythology, people getting sick because of their interactions with this statue. It takes itself quite a bit more seriously than the last 2 Gamera films, and isn't just a straight campy kids movie. It's definitely still a kids movie, but it's more directed towards all ages than the last 2 were, not just exclusively for kids like the last 2 were. And in that way, it's kind of interesting, and I was actually really happy to see that kind of return to form for the franchise, because I love Gamera vs. Gauss, and to see it return to that kind of tone, I was very excited. However, ultimately, Gamera vs. Jiger is a really mixed bag for me, because while I enjoyed that return to form in terms of a campy Gamera movie that takes itself slightly more seriously and isn't just a complete farcical comedy aimed at kids, and is a return to more of a serious monster story, it's not necessarily a good serious monster story, and relies quite a bit on rehash and ideas that the franchise has used before, and straight up ripping off monsters that they've done before in order to tell this more serious monster story. Ultimately, Gamera vs. Jiger is just a mixed bag of different ideas that kind of got thrown into a pot, and the writers just kind of threw it up on screen and said, there you go, there's Gamera vs. Jiger. I like most of the ideas the movie puts forward, but they never really jive together, which I think is the biggest problem it has. And overall, the movie just never really comes together. And it's not like the first movie or Barrogan, where even if all of its elements didn't really come together overall, it's still a fun movie. It is definitely a fun movie at points, but the problem is that most of its ideas, while slightly cool, are ideas that this franchise has done before. And now that I've mentioned Barrogan, I think that I should at least say right now, I'll get more in detail with this, that oh my god, is this movie such a ripoff of Gamera vs. Barrogan. And not a very good ripoff either. The story is disturbingly similar, not disturbingly, but it's shockingly similar to Gamera vs. Barrogan, which we'll outline in a second when we get into the plot synopsis. And the monster itself, Jiger, he or she or whatever it is, I'll ask this question later on, is a straight-up Barrogan ripoff with a little bit of Guiron thrown in terms of firing out sharp projectiles that don't allow Gamera to go into his shell. So the movie doesn't really offer you that much in terms of original ideas, but it's not bad at all. It's just kind of mediocre, but it does put some good ideas forward, and I do enjoy the return to tone, so let's outline all of that as we get into the plot synopsis. So here's basically how Gamera vs. Jiger goes down. So we open in Japan and are introduced to a couple of kids, and we learn that there's some kind of expo going on in Japan called Expo Land 1970, apparently a big World's Fair that's being held in Japan with a theme all about the progressiveness of mankind and a bright, bright future. And our main character, Hiroshi, a kid, is being taken on a tour of Expo Land by his sister's boyfriend, Keisuke, who is, I guess, I'm trying to think of the word for it. He's not an anthropologist per se, but he studies ancient cultures. I don't know if you call him a historian or not, though, or an archaeologist. I'm not sure. He's something in that wide umbrella of science exposition dude. In my notes, I lovingly referred to him as Professor Exposition Pants. And I referred to Hiroshi as Hiroshi Eyebrows McGee, because mother of God, look at those eyebrows. So we learned about all this stuff from those two talking, and we also learned that as part of a prized member of the collection that Expo Land 1970 is going to be showing off will be a statue flown in from an island in Africa called Wester Island. This statue is apparently rumored to be a relic from a lost civilization, the civilization of Mu, the Pacific version of the Atlantis myth. And we all know how connected Gamera is to Atlantis, so it's kind of interesting that they decided to bring that up. And Keisuke wants to get his hands on it because he wants to study it and see if it answers any questions about what happened to the civilization of Mu and what exactly was the deal with them. However, an African gentleman, we never really get any kind of specific ethnicity for him, shows up at Expo Land and starts ranting and raving at all the people running it that they can't bring the statue there because it's apparently got some kind of curse. The curse he just refers to as Jiger. Apparently, anywhere this thing goes, it brings death, and apparently brings something called the Devil's Whistle, which we'll learn about later on. Cut to Wester Island, where Hiroshi's friend Jimmy, an American boy, because for some reason the later Showa Gamera movies always feel the need to pair up a Japanese kid with an American kid, and his father, who is heading up the expedition in order to dig up the statue and bring it to Expo Land. Using helicopters with jets coming out of the bottom of them. The fuck is the point of that anyway? So they're raising the statue out of the ground. However, out of nowhere, none other than Gamera shows up, trying to prevent the expedition team from removing the statue. Jimmy, having learned about Gamera from Hiroshi, tells his father not to shoot at Gamera and that he's only trying to help, saying that something must be wrong with the statue if Gamera is trying to intervene in them trying to remove it. Jimmy's father is having none of it, however, and has all of his men shoot at Gamera when Gamera knocks the statue out of the grasp of the helicopters. And this causes Gamera to shy away from the camp, and is followed by a volcano erupting, which, as we've established, always attracts the attention of Gamera. But Jimmy and his father end up removing the statue anyway and send it via boat to Japan. In the meantime, two things happen, two aspects of this curse that the African gentleman earlier mentioned. One, and this happens first, importantly, I'll talk about this in a second, a giant monster we of course call Jiger wakes up, coming out of the ground under where the statue was. However, Gamera is not far away and comes out of the volcano to fight Jiger, and the two have their very first fight. Very, very early on in the movie. Again, very reminiscent of Gauss. And Jiger manages to outmaneuver Gamera by firing out these spiky projectiles that go into Gamera's arms and prevent him from tucking his legs inside of his shell, and then flipping him over on his shell so that way he can't fly away, meaning he'll be stuck there, which is kind of a cool callback to the first movie. Jiger then goes on a rampage, destroying a bunch of ships on his way to Japan, following the statue. Meanwhile, however, on the ship carrying the statue, all of the sailors have fallen ill because of the curse carried by the statue. We're not sure what exactly is causing it yet, though of course the doctor on board suspects poison or some kind of viral or bacterial infection that's caused by some kind of exotic hoo-da-ha. Anyway, all of the sailors get sick and end up at port in Japan and can't unload the statue. However, a bunch of harbor workers nearby decide to take up a little extra money by Keisuke, who offers them extra money in order to get the statue off if they'll risk their lives, which they do, and get the statue off and get it into Expo Land. However, right after the statue has been removed, all of the harbor workers then start to be afflicted by a similar thing to the sailors. They start falling over and convulsing and screaming in pain. Immediately following this, the ship that was containing all of the sailors is destroyed by Jiger, who now enters Japan and goes on a rampage, looking for the statue. The military counterattacks, but is unable to do anything because Jiger has this super ultraviolet ray type of deal, which is pretty much Barugan's rainbow from Barugan. Meanwhile, Gamera is able to escape from Jiger's subduing of him by using a rock to lift himself up and pull out the spikes that were inside of his legs. And it takes forever, by the way. It's like a 5-minute scene of Gamera pulling these things out of his legs, and then flies off to go fight Jiger. Gamera ends up in Japan, has his second fight with Jiger, and is once again defeated when Jiger stabs something inside of Gamera's torso, which causes Gamera to fall sick, and he falls over, and strangely becomes frozen on one of his legs and his head. I have no idea why, and they never ever explain it in the movie, so that's just a bizarre scene. The rest of the movie is kind of all over the place. The military is trying to come up with a way to get rid of Jiger. However, they can't come up with anything because they have no idea what exactly the statue has done to cause all of the sailors to fall ill, and what exactly it does to Jiger. I almost called him Barugan for a second. You can see why. They want to look at the statue, however, and see if there's anything on it that would signify what exactly about it causes Jiger pain, because it does seem to cause Jiger pain, and what exactly is causing all the illness. However, right when they come up with that idea, Jiger attacks Expo Land, gets the statue, picks it up, and throws it into the water, which obviously gets it away from him, and he is then relieved of some kind of pain, which we later learn on in the movie is because the statue emits a supersonic frequency that messes around with Jiger's ears, and the frequency of his super ultraviolet ray, which is a high frequency. No, it's a low frequency, while the whistle is a high frequency. It's all very, very confusing. And doesn't really make any kind of sense, at least to me. All hope seems lost. However, Hiroshi and Jimmy proposed the idea of trying to find out what's wrong with Gamera and using Gamera to kill Jiger. So they use a giant X-ray camera to take a big X-ray snapshot of Gamera, and a scientist boldly declares Gamera's anatomy is similar to that of a turtle. Say what? Anyway, so we find out that Jiger has injected something into Gamera, which they first say might be cancer cells, but we know that can't be true because that makes no fucking sense. And especially since Gamera survived a nuclear bomb in the first movie, I'm pretty sure he would be pretty immune to cancer. We then learn from one of the scientists that it's not cancer, but in fact a parasite that Jiger has injected into him. And it is some kind of larval spore that will hatch and kill Gamera as it hatches and grows. They have to find. They then decide they have to find a way to go inside of Gamera and remove the parasites. However, they have no ideas on how they're going to do it. Hiroshi and Jimmy. Oh, by the way, they show this like disgusting video that causes everybody in the movie to grimace in terror, and it also caused me to grimace in terror. Where the scientist like shows this video. He's like, because he says he knows about all this larval spore stuff because he says he had an elephant in one of his zoos a couple years back that got really sick and had this giant growth inside of its trunk that was preventing it from breathing, and they cut open the growth and a bunch of parasites fell out, which looks like spaghetti. It's fucking disgusting. And everybody in the movie is just like, oh, that's fucking gross. And I had a verbal outcry. When I was Googling information on this movie, one of the first things that popped up was Gamera versus Jiger elephant scene. So apparently I'm not the only one to have been disturbed by this scene. Anyway, so Hiroshi and Jimmy use this miniature submarine that Hiroshi's dad was building for the expo to actually swim inside of Gamera and try and remove the larval spore themselves. However, by the time they get in there, the larva has hatched and tries to kill them, and basically the larva is just a human-sized version of the giant Jiger version. And it tries to kill them. However, they use a busted communicator to kill the monster by throwing it at the little orb that fires out the supersonic type of ultra ray, whatever it is, and that kills the monster. They then decide they want to employ this on a mass scale, trying to recreate the frequency that the devil whistle, which is why it's called that, which is the name of the statue, caused, in order to prevent Jiger from causing any more damage until Gamera is revived, which they do by shocking him with like 7 million volts of electricity, and or kilowatts, whatever the voltage or whatever the term is. They shock Gamera, he wakes up, and Jiger goes on a rampage again with the frequency not working. So Gamera and Jiger then have their third and final fight, in which Gamera uses 2 telephone poles. Oh god, this scene. Gamera uses 2 telephone poles as basically big earmuffs to like stick inside of his ears, so that way Jiger's ultraviolet ray won't affect him. That's hysterical. Gamera defeats Jiger by beating him up for a while, then going back into the ocean, finding the devil's whistle, and then throwing it into Jiger's head, which completely devastates him/her. So the day is saved, the monster is defeated, everybody learns a big lesson about childhood innocence, I guess, I don't know. And the day is saved, and Gamera flies Jiger's corpse off to Wester Island to be restored to its proper place. So how about this story? For me, the biggest problem I had with it was there wasn't enough forward momentum in the story. There's just so many different unconnected ideas going on that there's no individual element that drives you through all these ideas. This is a similar thing that I had with Gamera vs. Barugan. However, it's made worse here because this movie doesn't have the characters that movie had in terms of driving its story forward. The characters in this don't really have much of a personality, and honestly, they don't have much to do in the story because the movie is so centered around the fights between Gamera and Jiger that there's not really anything else going on in them. Everything with the curse and with the statue is rushed so quickly just to get to the monster fights that the whole movie becomes about the monster fights and about getting the monsters together. And it leads to it feeling very jaggedly paced and being awkwardly paced, because you're just waiting for the next fight to come around, and that's all the story is doing, is just building up to the next fight. It leads to a story that never really comes together. It has a bunch of really potentially good elements that just never really come together because there's nothing driving the story forward. For instance, the different ideas that are posed in here. I mean, one thing, I like the idea of bringing this franchise back to its monster movie roots. I like the idea of doing another monster story building up to a horrific monster with Jiger, with the whole curse of the statue thing, and with stealing this, or not stealing it, but removing this statue, causing a monster to be awakened. It's all a good idea. The problem is, this, again, kind of like the first Gamera movie, there's no build up to the monster. The statue is removed, Gamera has a conniption fit, and then Jiger just appears, with no build-up to it whatsoever. There's a little bit more to it than the original Gamera, but even it's still a bit of a problem because there's not enough build-up. You never get the weight exactly of what's going on, and you never quite get the foreboding atmosphere that you got in Berrigan or even Gauss. Also, another major problem I have with this movie is that they show Jiger way too quickly. Again, in a monster movie like this, you want to build up the monster as much as possible. And they don't do that at all here, and one problem with it is that we see a bunch of impacts of the awakening of Jiger after we see the monster appear, which is usually not how monster movies work, and it's really counterintuitive to the impact of the monster. So for instance, the whole curse thing. We really should have seen the impact the statue was having on the crew before we saw Gamera fight Jiger, because the impact of that sickness is lessened because we just saw the huge monster fight, so we already know why it's happening and how grave the situation is. So the illness is then kind of pointless, except that it's kind of a plot thing because it's building up the reveal about the whole frequency business, except I don't understand how not being used to a sound wave can make you sick. I don't understand how that works at all. Because it's not just a whole pain thing where the frequency is just causing everybody to be in pain. No, it's an illness. It's causing a physical sickness, and I don't really know how that works. So the impact of the monster and the impact of the situation is drastically lessened by the fact that we see all of the impacts of it after the monster has already appeared and already had a monster fight. It's playing your cards too early. The build up to these things is very important because you want to start small and get progressively bigger, bringing the audience along with you as you build up the situation, which is ultimately the biggest problem with this thing as a monster movie. It just never really has the proper impact. And the other problem with that is that the movie is really jaggedly put together. Every individual idea seems to have its own section. So you have one thing about the monster with the statue, then you have the fight between Gamera and Jiger, or I guess the fights between Gamera and Jiger. Then you have the idea about Hiroshi and Jimmy taking a submarine inside of Gamera's body and getting an exploration inside of Gamera's body. Then you have the whole business about the frequency stuff with hurting Jiger, and we're back to that whole thing of killing the monster with some kind of creative scientific method. None of these ideas really come together. None of them really, with the possible exception of the whole trip through Gamera's body, are really done that well where they set themselves apart from the rest of the series, particularly using some kind of creative means to kill the monster. It's really not that creative. It's not all that great compared to using a jewel to drown a monster, or using fake blood to attract a monster and then throwing off its equilibrium and letting it dying in the sun. It's not nearly as good as any of that. And again, it doesn't really matter because it's just being used as a distraction to give Gamera enough time to recover. Now, what I do like about this story is that there's plenty for Gamera to do. He gets plenty of focus here, and plenty of screen time as well. But the problem is that it leads to the humans not having enough to do, and again, it leads to the whole movie revolving around the monster fights. And that always leads to a really bad pacing if the movie isn't just 2 hours of monsters fighting. If every single aspect of the story comes down to two monsters beating the shit out of each other, the movie almost always fails pacing-wise. If there's nothing else dramatically going on with the monsters individually from each other, or with the humans reacting to the monsters. So that's always very important, and this movie doesn't really get that right at all. However, the whole thing is kind of jaggedly toned as well, because we have this really goofy idea of swimming inside of Gamera and saving his life, but then we've also got that offset with the more serious story about the curse and about the monster stuff. It just feels too... It feels like one of them should have been focused on more than the other, and I like both ideas, though the whole idea of swimming inside of Gamera's body is way more interesting than the curse. So, not that I'm saying you can't do both in one movie, but they just feel too separate to be part of the same movie. And that's kind of how I feel about everything. There's no through line. Everything just kind of happens. And I think that having a more pronounced human story, or really any kind of human story, would have helped that a lot, which will bring us into the characters. Which, maybe that would give a connotation of I'm going to come on and say I hate them. No, to the contrary, I actually really like these characters. My problem is they don't get enough to do. They're all fairly likable, with the possible exception of Jimmy's parents, who come off as assholes. But I love Hiroshi's parents, especially his dad. His dad is awesome. He's this super chill, like imaginative big kid who just clearly loves his son, and just, I love his dad so much. He's played by a great actor, and he's just having a good time with the role, and he's always fun and warm to watch. I really like Hiroshi's dad. But all in all, the characters just don't really get enough to do, and they just all come off as really flat, particularly the kids, which, I guess it's kind of a different problem than them being annoying. I don't really find them annoying in this movie as I did Masao and Jim and Gamera vs. Virus. I just find them more flat. They don't get enough to... they get a little bit more to do than the adults do, but they just don't really have any personality. They just kind of do things. They don't have a reason for doing them except that Hiroshi feels some kind of loyalty to Gamera, and we have no idea why. And Jimmy is just kind of along for the ride with Hiroshi. So, they just don't get enough personality for me to buy that they would risk their lives to swim inside of Gamera to try and save him. And I also don't buy that their parents would be as cool with them doing this as they are. I would have imagined that adults doing it probably would have been more to their liking, but they do react to it a little bit, so that's fine. I kind of wish that we would have had a little bit more of a human story in this one. Not that there isn't necessarily anything going on with the characters, but it's so pushed into the background that it's hardly even there. For instance, there's an idea of Hiroshi's dad being kind of a big kid and not doing a great job at raising his son, and that his sister actually has to be the stern one and raise him in that way. Again, going back to that idea in a fucking Gamera movie, with the sister having to raise the younger brother. But that's not really brought to the forefront. They don't really do anything with it. It's just kind of an idea that lingers under the surface of the monster fight story. So, honestly, I could have gone for a little bit of a human story in this one, just to kind of give us some kind of through line, give us some kind of perspective to make all of these ideas come together, because they really don't. And I think that giving us some kind of human story would have been the best way to do that. So, aside from that, I really don't have anything else to say about the characters. They're not terrible, but they're not good. So, they're just kind of there. They're mostly likable, but they just don't get enough to do, and they don't get enough personality. So they just don't help any in giving the movie any kind of forward momentum. But that will bring us into the monsters, who the movie really focuses on. Again, Gamera vs. Jiger is almost entirely about the titular fights between Gamera and Jiger. And each scene, regardless of whether or not it's about people or monsters, is really used to build up to the next monster fight. And let's start off with Jiger. Herself, though. See, I'm watching these on the Gamera Legacy Collection, and my translations said he, but I didn't think about this until I was doing some research on the movie, and wouldn't Jiger have to be a she if it's implanting an embryo into Gamera's body? Maybe it's asexual, maybe it's able to change its sex, which would make sense because Jiger, interestingly, is more of an amphibian than it is a reptile. It has an overall lizard-like body structure, but it actually has more amphibian-like qualities with the stickers on the bottom of its feet and the fact that it swims in water. And it looks overall like a giant salamander, which is something I kind of like. And we need more amphibian-based kaijus, guys. We need to cut it out with the big lizards. Let's throw in some frogs, some salamanders, some toads. I don't know. Give us some amphibian kaiju. But overall, Jiger itself, I'm gonna say him though because I will otherwise fuck it up. Jiger himself, he's really just okay. He's just a little bit above Virus for me for being the most generic Gamera monster. He just doesn't get anything uniquely his own that has him stand out in Gamera's Rogues Gallery. All of the things about his design and characterization and power set have all been done before and been done better. Again, almost everything. Again, the ultraviolet ray that he shoots out is right off of Barugan. And all in all, Jiger himself is a big Barugan knockoff, as is his story. And, you know, the ultraviolet ray is Barugan's rainbow. He doesn't really get an he does get an equivalent to the cold freezing thing because he seemingly freezes Gamera in the movie when Gamera gets the embryo injected, falls into the bay, and then freezes in place. Is that ice? Is it stone? See, when I watched the movie, I was waiting for a line to explain whether or not Jiger was turning Gamera into a statue. But that line never came. He just seemed to be freezing him in place so that way the embryo could develop, I guess. They don't really explain it. But again, it just leads to Jiger just coming off as a big Barugan knockoff. Again, with a little bit of Guiron thrown in, because we've got he fires out these like pin needles that shoot into Gamera's body, and that comes off of Guiron with the shurikens. The only interesting thing about Jiger that really makes him distinctly his own is the whole laying an egg inside of Gamera's body thing. That's actually pretty cool. And I think the best part about Jiger, because overall his design, again, he looks almost exactly like Barugan. And there isn't really enough about him design-wise to set him apart from Barugan where he's really worth anything. He's got a couple extra horns, his face looks a little bit different, and again, he's got the kind of salamander thing going on, but all in all, he's just basically another Barugan. And this movie overall is kind of a strange amalgam of being a ripoff of Barugan and a ripoff of Gauss. So, I know those are my two favorite Showa Gamera movies, but I wanted the tone borrowed from those movies, not the stories and the monsters. I wanted them to continue to tell original stories just with those tones. Also, in terms of Jiger's backstory and origin, I like the idea of him coming from Mu. It gives him this kind of interesting connection to Gamera that the movie doesn't even kind of address, but as somebody who's been watching all the movies, it kind of gives you this interesting connection where they were both monsters with legends about them that were based on ancient civilizations. So I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it's something that definitely stuck out to me and something that I did like. I just wish that they explored it a little bit more. Again, kind of like the first Gamera movie, they give this really bizarre origin and then they don't explain it at all. It's like, he comes from Mu, deal with it. Wait a minute, what does coming from Mu exactly mean? Was he created by the people there? Was he just some kind of monster that lived there? But the last question I had regarding Jiger was, why exactly does Jiger follow the statue to Japan? Is he... See, the idea, again, it's kind of borrowing this from Barugan, of Barugan coming to Japan because he was inside of the opal. But it doesn't make any sense with Jiger because the statue is the thing that's keeping him imprisoned. Why would he follow it? Just because he wants to destroy it so that way he can never be imprisoned again? Okay, fine, but it's brought to Japan and they want to leave it there. Why doesn't he just go on a rampage on the completely opposite side of the world? What's attracting him to the statue? What about the statue does he want or need? if not just to destroy it, because again, that's not a good enough reason. I don't know why he wouldn't just think that they would keep it and then he would go off and do his own thing and they would never put 2 and 2 together. Because the only reason they put 2 and 2 together, of the high frequency thing being the thing that can hurt Jiger, is because of what it does to him and the sailors. So they really should have just let it happen. So Jiger really should have just let the statue been brought to Japan and should have just gone their separate ways. I don't know what the hell he was thinking. But let's move on to Gamera himself. My only real problem with Gamera in this movie is his design. I mean, if you're looking at the stills right now on the screen, he looks pretty consistent with what he's looked like in the rest of the Showa series, but there's something really weird going on with his face, and the only way I could think to describe it was that he looks too snake-like to be a giant turtle. There's just something about his head that makes him look more like a snake. It looks flatter on the top and more narrow on the... He looks more boxy, so he looks like a big snake with a shell. In terms of Gamera himself, though, characterization-wise, the only real idea in this movie that I took away from it that I really liked was I liked the idea of Gamera having to contend with people in order to protect the Earth. Again, that's something that the Heisei series will take and do really good things with, but it's seated here and it's kind of interesting because you've got people here who are kind of ruining the Earth and threatening the Earth, but Gamera doesn't have any means of communication of telling them what they're doing is hurting the Earth. So, the only thing he can possibly do to prevent this catastrophe from happening is by intervening and trying to stop them from removing the statue. And he's a big giant monster. The only way he can do that is by attacking them. So, I really like that idea, and I love the idea of children having to defend Gamera, and there's an interesting idea of children losing their faith in Gamera when Jimmy comes home to Japan and tells Hiroshi that he lied to him about Gamera, because Gamera attacked his camp, and then Hiroshi takes up for Gamera. That idea is really, really interesting. Again, it'll be done more things with later, but it's here, and I kind of like it. But I think they flip too quickly where everybody is then trying to help Gamera. I know that they would have revealed that they would have realized that he was right, but again, it's just a matter of the movie doesn't jive well together. Things set up in the first act don't really follow into the third act, and everything just kind of feels like a mishmash of different ideas. My only other question about Gamera was, how does he know about the whole statue thing? Can he just sense that there's a giant monster under it that he maybe one day thought he might have to fight if the statue got removed? How does he know that removing the statue is going to cause Jiger to awaken? The thing I was thinking was, in Gamera Guardian of the Universe, they explain that Atlantis and Mu were the same civilization, that they're just called different things in different civilizations, and that they were both the same thing. In this movie, they just mention Mu, they don't even mention Atlantis, so I'm almost wondering if that's the same idea here, that Atlantis and Mu are supposed to be the same civilization. Which makes me question if maybe Gamera and Jiger have met before, if their species have fought before, and that's how Gamera knows about the statue and knows about Jiger. This is nowhere in the movie, but it's the only thing I could think of, aside from Gamera just sensing that something dangerous was going to happen if they removed the statue. So, I'm not sure how exactly Gamera knows what's going to happen. Unless, of course, he read the script, which is always possible as well, because Gamera is God, basically, if you think about it. The only other question I had about Gamera, aside from liking the whole thing about the kids having to travel inside of him, I think that's a really cool and interesting idea, and it's fun. Again, as a kid's movie, it's a fun thing to have happen. But the only other question I had was, why did Gamera's inside look like a cave? He's got like a cave floor. The walls of his lungs are really tiny compared to what they would really have to be for a creature his size. And again, they just look like a big cave. So I'm not sure how exactly that makes sense biologically. But all in all, Gamera is pretty good in this movie. He's got plenty of screen time. I like how much he has to do in the story in terms of being focused on. In fact, I almost think in a certain way he's almost too focused on, which is really weird given some of my thoughts on this whole series. But I think that comes from, he's just... The whole movie is about the fights, and there's just not enough going on with it where... there's just not enough unique, interesting ideas to kind of carry the whole hour-and-a-half movie. But he's fun, he's well personified here, and he's pretty consistent with what's been going on. except that his design is a little off. But that'll bring us into the monster fights and the special effects. The monster fights are pretty good. They're pretty consistent with what we were seeing in Gamera vs. Guiron, though the special effects this time are actually a little bit more well-made. There's a little bit more of a high production quality going on in this movie. I'm not sure if the budget was higher or if they had more time to make it, but the production quality is certainly higher, and that's always welcome. But the monster fights are about as good as Gamera vs. Guiron were. Again, there's not much interesting stuff fight-wise going on because Jiger himself is kind of a knockoff of Guiron and of Barugan. So I feel like I've kind of seen these Gamera fights before, so they're not really that much fun to watch, but they are fun to watch and they are entertaining, and certainly better than the fight between Gamera and Virus. But special effects wise, again, there are moments that look way better than the past two movies, but then there are also moments that look as bad as the last two movies. And those moments mainly come in, again, as I said last time, whenever the monsters aren't suits. So whenever Gamera is flying, he doesn't look that good. Not when he's spinning, but when he's actually outstretched and he's, like, flying. Like Superman, almost. And Jiger looks awful whenever he, like, jumps into the air. Oh, because I didn't mention this earlier, the only other thing that sets Jiger apart from the monsters that he seems to be ripping off is that he's able to fly for a short distance. He's able to fire jets out of the side of his mouth and then fly. What? And it looks really, really awkward. Jiger's suit overall also doesn't look that good. I just don't think it's shot very well. Overall, the cinematography in this movie, special effects-wise, isn't that great. They just don't shoot the miniatures correctly. There's a very specific way you have to shoot suitimation to make it look good, and the Gamera franchise has always struggled with that, and this one falls short a little bit in that department. The miniatures themselves aren't bad, but the way they're shot just don't look that good. And Jiger's suit just looks too foldy. There's too many times where the legs will move forward and they'll kind of buckle under their own weight, and they just don't look that good. Also, another problem with the special effects, the monsters' mouths hang open way too much in this movie, and that really takes away from the illusion of them looking like real creatures. Both of them have that. Both of them, their mouths just hang open for like 5 minutes and they're still roaring, and their mouths would close if they were real creatures, but it just doesn't look very good in terms of that. The only other special effect thing I'd like to mention that while I don't think the design of Gamera's insides make any sense, they certainly look good. The giant tonsil that Hiroshi and Tommy almost bang into looks great. They're brought to life in a good way. I believe that I was looking at. Well, I don't know if I believe that I was looking at the insides of Gamera himself, but they certainly looked unique, and that was kind of cool. But overall, the special effects are just okay, as they've kind of been for the past couple movies. They're cheaper in some ways, but also more well-made in some ways. And that kind of overall sums up my feelings on the movie. Gamera vs. Jiger is a big mixed bag of different things. It's sometimes better than the last two movies, and sometimes a lot more boring than Gamera vs. Guiron, at least. I think it's a way better movie than Gamera vs. Versus Virus. It's a kind of a big double-edged sword. I like the return to tone of Gamera vs. Gyaos, a decent mix of the campy and of the more serious nature of making a straight-laced monster movie, but I just don't think it's balanced well enough, and I think the movie needed more of a through line story-wise. Again, it's a decent monster fight movie. It has very little wrong with it in terms of being a good monster fight movie, except that there's no through line. There's nothing to get you through the scenes that are building up to the monster fight. It just kind of feels like one giant circle of Gamera fights Jiger, loses, recovers, fights him again, loses, recovers, fights him again, defeats him. So that isn't great. And overall, the movie has a bunch of decent ideas of the curse, of the monster fights, of kids taking a submarine inside of Gamera's body. It just never finds a good way to gel all of those together. So that's my biggest problem with it. Ultimately, the story is the biggest misstep of this whole movie, is that it just never really comes together. And to every single thing the movie does right, it does something wrong. But the overall package is the biggest part of this. So, do I think this movie is entertaining? Yeah, but it's not especially worth watching. In terms of the overall Showa Gamera series, I don't think it's the worst movie by any stretch of the imagination, but it is certainly one of the more mediocre, and one of the most disappointing, because it has some good ideas that it doesn't do enough with. But, again, if you're watching these movies, it's definitely not one that I would skip unless you're really just trying to get to the really good stuff. Then you can skip it. But in terms of just looking for the stuff that is just good overall, I would say that this one's worth watching, but again, it's boring at points, it needed more of a through line, but it is fairly entertaining. So, bearing that in mind, I'm going to give Gamera vs. Jiger a 2 out of 5. It's slightly below average for me because it doesn't introduce enough interesting ideas, and the monster that the movie is so completely focused on, that Gamera is fighting and that the whole story revolves around, is just too much of a ripoff of previous Gamera monsters to really inspire any kind of creativity or excitement in the audience. So that's my biggest problem with it in terms of that. So overall, not bad, but not great. So just kind of in between, but slightly below average because of the mediocrity of the monster itself. So that is going to do it for my review of Gamera vs. Jiger from 1970. And I hope you will join me as we continue along into the land of the unknown of Gamera movies that I haven't seen, when we get into 1971's Gamera vs. Zigra. I hope you guys will join me for that review. Until next time, sayonara, kids.